Not long before she died in 1988, Margarita Lasky, who was a well-known secular humanist and novelist, said these words, "What I envy most about you Christians is your forgiveness. I have nobody to forgive me." We read in Ephesians 2 the incredible forgiveness we have from God, a forgiveness that comes not from anything we do or deserve, but strictly by His grace and His kindness and His great love. He forgives us who had no hope, who were separated from Him hopelessly, dead in our trespasses and sins, and brings us into His presence to love us and to let us live with Him, to be a part of His family and of His kingdom. Read it, it's pretty good. In Matthew chapter 18, verses 21 through 35, we read this story from Jesus. Then Peter came up and said to Him, "Lord, how often will my brother sin against me, and I forgive him? As many as 7 times?" Jesus said to him, "I do not say to you 7 times, but 77 times. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his servants. When he began to settle, one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents. And since he could not pay, his master ordered him to be sold with his wife and children and all that he had, and payment to be made. So the servant fell on his knees, imploring him, 'Have patience with me, and I will pay you everything.' And out of pity for him, the master of that servant released him and forgave him the debt. But when that same servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii, and seizing him, he began to choke him, saying, 'Pay what you owe.' So his fellow servant fell down and pleaded with him, 'Have patience with me, and I will pay you.' He refused and went and put him in prison until he should pay the debt. When his fellow servants saw what had taken place, they were greatly distressed, and they went and reported to their master all that had taken place. Then his master summoned him and said to him, 'You wicked servant, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. And should not you have had mercy on your fellow servant as I had mercy on you?' And in anger his master delivered him to the jailers until he should pay all his debt. So also shall my heavenly Father will do to every one of you, if you do not forgive your brother from your heart." And Colossians 3:13 says, "Bearing with one another, and if one has a complaint against another, forgiving each other, as the Lord has forgiven you, so you also must forgive." And in Jesus' model prayer, He taught us to pray, "Forgive us our trespasses," or our debts, as we forgive our debtors or those who trespass against us. Now, I've been asked to summarize a journey in forgiveness that I have traveled, and let me make this very clear. It's not because I'm so good at it, but because I was not. Perhaps you can get a head start in your own journey when it's needed. And if you haven't already needed it, I'm sorry to bear this news to you, you will. Way back before any of you were thought of, in 1977, on Labor Day, it was interesting that I started to think, and I don't know why, because this was not something I traditionally would think about, but I had been thinking about how blessed my family and I were. Now, our family was not perfect. In fact, a lot of my family were not even believers at the time, but we had had very minimal problems, got along fairly well, no tragedies to speak of, no untimely deaths. And I don't know why at that particular time I was thinking of that. But I have an idea it might have been connected to the phone call that I received about 2-something in the morning when my dad was on the phone and he said, "Jimmy is gone." And I said, "What do you mean gone?" And he said, "He's dead." And I said a very irrational thing in my shock. I said, "You're kidding." And he said, "Would I kid you about this?" And that was an experience that I had never gone through. I went through all of the shock and the numb feelings, not knowing what to do. We were in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and they were in western Pennsylvania, Newcastle, Pennsylvania. My oldest brother called and said, just get up here, get on a plane. I'll take care of it. We'll work things out. You need to get up here. So I flew into Pittsburgh. Brenda and I flew into Pittsburgh, and there my grandparents and my uncle came to meet me, and it was one of the most awkward times of my life because it was like there was nothing to say. And they were in the same awkwardness. It was an unusually quiet meeting. We were heading home to Newcastle, and I said, do you know anything else? And my uncle said, no, we don't know anything. We just know he was lying beside the car. And perhaps he had a medical problem nobody knew about. So we drove to Newcastle, and then I had to go in to meet with my parents and my brothers. And again, it was a very odd and awkward time. Seems like there's no appropriate words. At least I didn't have any wisdom for appropriate words at that time. And there was a lot of confusion because we couldn't find out what had gone on. We did know that the driver of the ambulance that night was actually a friend of my brother's, and he recognized him. And he said he got him to the hospital as fast as he could, but could not save him. And so we didn't know what was going on, and a police officer came, a state police officer, and my dad had asked my oldest brother to kind of be the point person because he was struggling to handle it. And I saw them walk out back in the backyard, and we could tell something was strange from the body language, and he came back and said, it looks like it might have been a hit and run. And so a few hours later, another police officer came, and they went back out again, and this looked even worse when we read the body language, and he came back and said it was not an accident, and said that Jim was killed intentionally. He was murdered, and that a man had planned his murder. The murderer was David Hanna. He secured a flashing police light, piece of Jeep axle, and a shotgun, pulled him over, got him out of the car with the gun, and beat him with the axle and ran over him twice to make it look like a hit and run. I remember in the trial going to hear David Hanna's confession in the courtroom, and he talked about how Jimmy said to him, I don't want any trouble, and that would be just like him. And all of this happened because, though married with children, David Hanna wanted Jimmy's fiancée, who had rebuffed his advances. And so he decided that if he could get rid of Jimmy, he would have a chance to get with his fiancée. Now, I struggled with this and with forgiveness. First of all, how could this happen to Jimmy? He was the most peaceful one of the bunch. And, any of my other brothers, my oldest brother, Robert, he would get into his scraps occasionally, and lived in Youngstown, Ohio for a while. He got into some there. And David, the one next, a year and a half older than me, I think he lived to fight. He didn't care if he lost or won. He just liked to fight. And I never did understand enjoying losing. I was always too skinny. I was the guy that was so skinny they could use me in biology class for the skeleton. And so I wasn't exactly the most intimidating character around. But there were times when it just seemed like it was the thing to do to get into a fight, and that's kind of what we did back then. And for better or for worse, I did that. But Jimmy was 20 years old. He was already the manager of Revco Pharmacy in Newcastle. He was engaged to be married. I met some of his employees when I got to Newcastle, and they came in, and they were talking about what a great guy he was, what a great boss. This 20-year-old kid was their boss. And they just said he came in just the last day of work, and he was so excited because he started telling us he was going to be an uncle, because Brenda and I just found out we were going to have our first child. And it hit me that he would never know my kids, and they would never know their Uncle Jimmy. So, I would like to tell you that I instantly felt forgiveness for David Hanna. I did not. In fact, I fell in love with the Old Testament principle of the next of kin being the one to bring justice. And I kid you not, I laid in bed at night thinking and dreaming of being the one that would bring justice. My dad became very bitter. His family had a history of being able to hold a grudge. I said the Miles family could compare with the Hatfields and McCoys. I mean, they could hold a grudge for a long time. And so this was the way that they were reared, or not reared, if you knew anything about their family. It was a horrible situation. And in fact, I was, I think, picking this up. Before I became a Christian, that was the last thing I was holding on to. You know, I was at a ball game one day, and a group of guys from another school decided to try to rearrange my face just because I went to the other school. And they did a fair job of it, and that's why I look this bad now. So you know, the thing you did, you had to get even. I mean, that's just what we did. Was the Miles code. It was kind of a cultural code around where I lived a lot too. And God was dealing with me, and I kept knowing I needed to get right with God, but I had to get this guy taken care of first, at least the one that was leading the group. And so I kept postponing it, and finally, every time I go to try to find out where he was, which is probably God's mercy because I would have been whipped again probably. But finally I said, God, I'm done with this. You take care of it. But back to Jimmy, or rather his killer. His murderer was a cocky and arrogant person. When I went to the trial, I would watch him confidently and swagger into the room, each session stopping to kiss his wife, which in my skepticism I viewed as an attempt to sway the jury. He couldn't have done anything to please me, but I can still see him. And this was the man that killed my little brother. You know, many tragic wrongs can never be reversed, and they have far-reaching consequences. My brother would never marry. In spite of his excitement, he would never know our firstborn child or either of our kids. Murder is irreversible, but so are many other wrongs. The desecration of one's person results from rape or incest or molestation. One of the greatest stories of forgiveness, one person I know that I would love someday for God to let her give her testimony, is somebody that went through a brutal rape of many people and became HIV positive. And I've never seen anybody more forgiving. She said maybe someday she can share that story. But there's many other things. Betrayal by people that somebody should be able to trust. Sometimes their own parent or others that should care about them. Crushing one's ability to believe in and to relate to others. Other wrongs are reversible, but they have lifelong wounds. Too many know the pain inflicted through condescending and condemning words. Betrayals and wrongs come in different modes and packages, but they all hurt. They cannot be forgotten. They can only be forgiven. Many of us find it seemingly impossible to accept forgiveness for ourselves. We feel like we cannot accept forgiveness because we do not deserve it. And that's true. We don't deserve it. What we did simply has to be unforgivable. Not so if you believe what God says. To refuse to receive forgiveness, to refuse to allow yourself to be set free from the penalty you deserve, is to refuse to believe in the power of Jesus' crucifixion on your behalf. He had Paul write to you that those who are in Christ are no longer under condemnation, Romans 8:1. And the kingdom of God is righteousness, joy, and peace in the Holy Spirit, Romans 14:17. A little hard to do that when we're keeping ourselves under condemnation and not accepting forgiveness. This is a gift God offers. Do not be ungrateful for what he offers. Take it. An acquaintance of mine from several years ago, he used to attend the same church I went to. I was with him on a trip to Israel, and somebody was telling me about his testimony. I had not even heard this testimony. So I asked Calvin about it. I said, can you tell me about this, your conversion? Do you mind if I ask? He said, no, not at all. And he was a man that had lived in sin, gotten away from God, grew up in a Christian home, had lost his family, many, many sad consequences because of his sin. And he felt like he could not be forgiven. And in despair, he went to Europe and bought a Euro rail pass where he could travel throughout Europe. He said he just got on a train and started going somewhere. And he ended up at a station, Haarlem, in the Netherlands. And he had read the book, The Hiding Place. And he said, I just wonder if that clock shop is still around. So he started walking and found it. And he walked into the door and stood there and looked around, and the lady at the counter said, yes, this is Corrie ten Boom's place. He said, how'd you know I was wanting to know? He said, I can tell. And he said, is Miss ten Boom here? She said, no, she's ill today, but we'd like you to sign the guest book. So he signed the guest book, and he made a comment. He didn't tell me what that comment was about the impact of The Hiding Place, the book, on his life. And the lady read it before he left, and she said, come back tomorrow. He said, why? She said, just come back tomorrow. So he returned, and she said, Miss ten Boom is still not well, but she's in the back room, and she would like to meet you. And so he went in there, and he said he just didn't know why. Just one of those people you could just pour your heart out to. And he started telling her about all of his sin and how bad he was and how he couldn't get back to God. And very simply, she said, Calvin, hand me that book, would you? And so he got the book, and he handed it over to her, and she didn't take it. He said it was a bit awkward. I'm standing there holding this book to her, and then finally she took it. And she said, oh, that wasn't so hard. Calvin, when somebody offers you something, just take it. Calvin said he prayed through, weeping at the couch with Corrie ten Boom, and became friends with her for the rest of her life, very close friends. What about you? Sometimes God is offering it to us, and you just won't take it. Why is it so hard to forgive? Let me give you some suggestions. The pain is so intense. I know that I should forgive because that's what the Bible tells me. I pray and ask God to help me forgive, but I just can't. Why is it so hard? It's hard because the pain is so intense it overwhelms our thinking. I've seen some of you guys, maybe not you guys, I don't go to the gym that often anymore, but I can remember times when somebody'd sprain their ankle down there and roll around on the floor and scream and holler, and they didn't care about losing their dignity. They were overwhelmed with pain. The pain takes over. Your attention is on the pain. And I think it comes that way with wounds that we often have to forgive. We're overwhelmed by the pain. Human nature defends itself. Maybe you're enjoying yourself at the picnic. You hear voices screaming from the ball field. Look out. You catch a movement of shadow coming in your direction. Forgetting everything else, you duck down and cover your head because you know somebody hit the ball over there and it's about to hit you in the head. You react in self-defense. It is unnatural to accept pain or fear without fight or flight. Unforgiveness is easy to justify. Why should I forgive my brother's murderer? Give me one good reason. I see no logic in forgiveness. He brutally killed Jimmy. He brutally traumatized my family. I watched my parents suffer pain that only a parent can. I watched it nearly destroy my dad. I watched my mother's heart break time and time again when something small would remind her. No, the killer deserves justice. The logic is the same with those other irreversible sins people inflict upon others. It's easy to conclude that unforgiveness is logical and right. After all, right is right and wrong is wrong. We justify unforgiveness because we think that forgiving the perpetrator betrays the victim. It seems disloyal to my loved one to forgive the one that hurt him. I am confident that was the battle that my dad fought nearly the rest of his life. He felt like he would betray his youngest son if he ever forgave his murderer. Well, what is forgiveness? It's not an emotion. I still hurt when I think of Jimmy's unnecessary death. I'll feel this even today, nearly 40 years later. Brenda apologized for not coming over today. She said, it just gives me such a heaviness. So it's not emotion. I still hate it when my mind returns to that courtroom. I hate it when my mind replays the scene of the man who robbed Jimmy from us swaggering in as someone to be honored. Dread wrapped itself around me like a dark cloud when I thought he was going to be freed on a technicality. I don't know yet how I would react if he's ever freed from his life sentence. It's difficult to label the emotion I feel when I think of the painful way he took Jimmy's life, knowing that Jimmy would never have hurt him. Or when I revisit my mother's broken heart and think of the pain that my father carried to his death. Can I forgive and still feel pain? And perhaps even anger? Forgiveness is a choice. Forgiveness chooses to forfeit what we think is rightfully ours. Forgiveness treats someone better than they deserve. Forgiveness releases somebody from a penalty they, get it now, deserve. Just like Jesus' forgiveness for us. It's not a matter of whether David Hanna deserves justice. He does. But that's not my job. In the story I read, the debtor who was forgiven much but did not want to forgive someone who owed him a little is a lesson in reality for all of us. I deserve death. So do you. I deserve hell. So do you. I deserve punishment for my sin that abused the love of God. I have wronged others, but of course I tell myself I never did anything as bad as murder. However, I don't want justice for my sins. Why should I demand it of someone else? I want mercy. We choose to love, therefore we must also choose to forgive. Well, what leads to this forgiveness? Well, I think one thing is the principle of substitution. When God taught the people of Israel about forgiveness and redemption, he gave them the substitutionary sacrifice. The lamb would bleed and die in their place for an atonement, for them to be forgiven. Jesus is God's substitute for our redemption. God chose to give what he did not owe for those who owed this debt. The man that killed my brother does not deserve forgiveness, but if I follow God's way of doing things, and I should, because he always does it right, then I will give this man what he does not deserve. When I found myself dreaming of living by the civil law of Israel in the Old Testament, where the next of kin could bring justice to the murderer, I became concerned as to whether I was going to be able to forgive this man. I believe God led me to a solution that worked for me. Let me briefly share it with you. When I was wrestling with this, and I had always prayed for my family, maybe you do the same thing, always in the same order. You know, my dad, my mom, my oldest brother, my next oldest, and then Jimmy, and then my extended family. Well, it was so tough. I'd be praying, and I'd get to Jimmy's name, and all I wanted to do was cry, feel sad, or get angry. And I guess it was God that prompted me. I can't say what all was behind it, but God definitely used it. One day when I was praying for my family, I got to Jimmy's name. And I felt so strongly inclined to put David Hanna's name. in place of Jimmy. Almost instantly, my attitude changed. I mean, then. You know why? I saw him through the eyes of God. We also have the principle of authority. I do not have the authority to extract vengeance. God alone has this authority. And please take time to read Romans 12 through parts of 13 and look at some of the key concepts in that passage. Do not pay back the evil you received with evil. Do everything within your power to live at peace with all people, even David Hannah. Never seek to get your own revenge, even against David Hannah. Give room for God to take care of this wrong. Vengeance belongs to God and God only. I remember trying to get around this scripture once. I hate to tell you all of my faults and failures, but might as well have gone this far. I sold a car to a guy I thought was my friend. I must have poor discernment. And he said, I'll bring the money back to you. And I sold him the car for so much, and I said, I want the brand new tires off it. No problem. Well, he disappeared. He went to another state with my car, and I didn't get any money. I was not real happy with that. And so somebody told me, said, hey, so-and-so's back in town. I saw your car. I said, really? I said, yeah, it's parked in his parents' yard. I said, okay. I still had a set of keys to my car. I had not ever signed the title over to him, so I went and got my car. And I knew that he would come for it, so I disabled it so he couldn't get it. And he came, and he was getting rather irate because I caught him out there trying to steal my car a second time. And I said, it's no problem. You can have the car. Hand me the money. Well, he came with the money, and he handed it to me. I said, and I'm so naive. Sometimes, I'm incredibly, I lack something. I'm not sure. Let's not go there. And I said to him, after he'd already done this, I said, now you know the deal. You get the car for this much, I get those new tires. Okay. And before he left, I remember calling him by name and pointing my finger at his nose. I said, I will get those tires. And I meant it. Sure enough, he didn't fail me. He stole my tires. And I found out where he worked. I said, I'm going to go get him. And God said, no, you're not. Vengeance is mine. This isn't vengeance, Lord. This is justice. Those are my tires. I really went through this. I was really being rational here. And for some reason, God doesn't have to back up because of my reasoning. Have you noticed that? I hope you have. If you haven't, I hope you will. I really went through this. Now, Lord, it's not right. He wouldn't let me go. I finally said, okay, if he can have my tires. But I'm going to go visit him. So I went. He worked at a service station. Back when you had service stations. Back when I actually could change tires and all that stuff. And I was walking up to him. He was out at the pumps. And I could tell he got ready for me. And he remembered what I had said. And I called him by name. And I said, I know. I said, relax. I know why you think I'm here. And I meant what I said. But God told me otherwise. God told me that vengeance is his. God can take care of my need for tires. I'm going to leave you in his hands. Wow, was he far more afraid of God, and he should have been, than me? It wasn't long. He had those tires off the car. He gave them to me, and he asked me to pray for him before he left. Now, I'm not telling you. Now, can you imagine if I'd have gone in? I could tell when I went in there, he wasn't afraid of me. He should have been. But he wasn't. Or if he was, he wasn't showing it. And I'm not saying it will always work out that way. It won't. but it taught me a lesson. Then we have the 70 times 7 principle, this great math formula of the Bible. I interpret it as 70 times 7. No matter how many times you have to forgive, one more time you forgive. Then there's a principle of investment. Romans 12 and 13 teaches us to do something to help the person who hurt you or someone you love. Now, this seems to go a bit too far. Be nice to someone who has been mean and abusive to you or someone you love? Matthew 6, Jesus said that anyone could love and be good to those that love you and are good to you. Any non-believer can do that. But we're Jesus followers. We're believers. We live differently, powerfully different. We are to love those who hate us and treat people that good that treat us badly. This is how we express God's love to the people of this world for whom Christ died. Romans 13:8 says, I don't owe anyone anything but love. Therefore, when I say I owe you something, what we owe is love and kindness. Love your neighbor as much as you love yourself. Treat that person with the same grace that you want to receive. Our love flows to wherever our investment or treasure is. This means we love what we value enough to devote ourselves to that. For where your treasure is, yes, there your heart will be also. Matthew 6:21. When you invest in people, you can start the road to loving them. Selfishness confines us by causing us to retreat into ourselves, making us small. When we love, we become bigger, more Christ-like people. Love, indeed, fulfills God's law, as Romans tells us. Joseph could forgive his brothers because he knew God's plan was bigger than his circumstances. Stephen clearly reflected Jesus' love by praying for forgiveness for his killers. The apostles rejoiced that they had the privilege to suffer on behalf of Jesus. When someone mistreats us, it is then that we have the opportunity to express God's love. My mother was an example of forgiveness. I'm not throwing stones at my dad. I'm not. If I had more time, I would tell you more about his journey. But my mother had an incredible conversion and transformation and grew faster than any Christian I have ever known in her middle years. And she was a believer at this time. She never seemed to hesitate. I've never seen a person hurt more because my mother loved deeply. But she also loved those who committed the crime. And she spent especially, and she invested in David Hanna's wife and kids. My dad would tell the hospital that David Hanna's wife was a nurse on the floor where my mother was. She contracted cancer shortly after this. My dad blamed that on the trauma. My son was born with needing surgery when he was 3 weeks old to remove a polycystic kidney. He blamed that on this. Everything was David Hanna's fault. And it could be some connection. But when she worked, Mrs. Hanna worked on that floor, my dad would tell the nurses and the doctors, do not let that woman walk in this door, ever. One time by accident she did, and he ran her out. When my dad wasn't there, my mother would invite her in and ask her how she was doing and if she could pray with her and she had any needs. Mom was a great example of forgiveness, but it's Jesus who expressed forgiveness perfectly. No one was treated more unjustly. No one was hurt as deeply, and no hurt is as deep as betrayed love. Therefore, no one could be hurt as deeply as Jesus. That's why love's risky, but never give up on it and never give up on forgiveness. I remember praying one time, struggling with what somebody did another time. I'm telling you, this was a journey for me. And I remember praying and I was doing my rationalization again. This person's wrong. And I had this strong impression in prayer, well, as soon as they treat you worse than you've treated me, well, that's not going to happen. The purest expression of love is made when it is not deserved. Therefore, I conclude that forgiveness may be the purest expression of love. Do not reject God's forgiveness. Forgive others. Yes, forgive yourself. Jesus said to. And accept the gift of freedom.